All right, so in this lesson, we're going to discuss solving equations in the form of x squared plus bx plus c equals 0. The concept for this is based on the zero product property. Remember, the zero product property is the basic idea that if a times b equals 0, then either a equals 0 or b equals 0. One of the two must be true. We use that concept to solve quadratic equations in this form. So let's take a look at example A here. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to take this equation, x squared minus 8x equals negative 12, and we need to set it equal to 0, which means we can use the concept of magic bridge. We could take this negative 12 and we can bring it over here to the other side of the equation, which would leave a 0 on the right hand side. So when I take negative 12 and I move it across the equal sign to the other side, it becomes a positive 12, and we end up with the equation x squared minus 8x plus 12 equals 0. So now our next step would be to factor x squared minus 8x plus 12. So we go to the previous lesson where we learned that since my c value is positive and my b value is negative, that means both of my binomials that I'm going to factor to are going to be x minus some number times x minus some number. So I have to now think, what are two numbers that multiply together to make positive 12 and add together to make negative 8? And that would be negative 2 and negative 6, right? Because 2 times 6 equals 12, and 2 plus 6 equals 8. And you see the negatives are here already. So we have x minus 2 times x minus 6 equals 0. Now, going to the concept of the zero product property, if a times b equals 0, then either a equals 0, b equals 0, or both, right? So if you think of this first binomial, x minus 2 as being a, and this second binomial, x minus 6 as being b, and we have, if a times b equals 0, then either a equals 0 or b equals 0 or both. So we use that concept to turn each binomial into their own equation equaling 0. So first I can write here x minus 2 equals 0, and then I have also x minus 6 equals 0. And then finally I'm just solving these very basic one-step equations here. So here x minus 2 equals 0. I add 2 to both sides, and I get x equals 2. And here, x minus 6 equals 0. I add 6 to both sides, and I get x equals 6. Let's take a look at another example here. Example B, we have x squared minus 2x equals 15. And again, I see that I want to take this equation, I want to set it equal to 0. So I need to take this positive 15 and I need to bring it to the other side of the equation. So this gives me x squared minus 2x minus 15 equals 0. All right? And I'm looking here and I see that my c value is negative, which tells me that this situation is going to be an x plus times an x minus. Because remember, our c value comes from multiplying, and the only way we can multiply two numbers together and end up with a negative is if one of the numbers is positive and the other number is negative. So I'm going to have x plus some number times x minus some number. So again, I'm looking at my c value, which is negative 15. And I need to think of two numbers multiplied together to make 15. And in this case, since they are opposite sign, we're not going to add together to make 2, we're going to subtract to make 2. So if I think of 3 times 5, 3 times 5 is 15, and 5 minus 3 is 2. So that is my combination that I want to use. And since my b value is negative 2, that means I need to place my larger of the two numbers, 5, next to the negative sign. So this has to be x plus 3 times x minus 5 equals 0. And just like the previous example, we need to take these and set them both equal to 0 in their own equations. So I have x plus 3 equals 0 and x minus 5 equals 0. So here, x plus 3 equals 0. How do I solve this? I have to subtract 3 from both sides. And that gives me x equals negative 3. And over here, x minus 5 equals 0. I have to add 5 to both sides. And this gives me x equals 5. And those are my two solutions here. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at some practice problems. I would encourage you to pause, work these out on your own, and then unpause and see if you got it right. Okay, so I'm going to take negative 54, and I'm going to move it here because I need to set this equation equal to 0. So this gives me x squared plus 15x plus 54 equals 0. So I can see that my b value and c value are both positive, so I know that both of my binomials are x plus. So x plus some number times x plus some other number. Think of two numbers that multiply together to make 54 and add together to make 15, and that would be 6 and 9. 6 times 9 is 54, and 6 plus 9 is 15. So I have here x plus 6 times x plus 9 equals 0. Now I want to set them both equal to their own, as their own equations, both equal to 0. And then solve. Here I would subtract 6 from both sides and get as my answer x equals negative 6. And over here, I'm going to subtract 9 from both sides and get x equals negative 9. Let me get this out of the way over here. All right, over here, this looks like strange, but that's just a regular minus sign, okay? So we're going to take this negative 12 and move it over here. So this gives me x squared minus 13x plus 12 equals 0. So since my c value is positive and my b value is negative, this tells me that my two binomials are x minus. So I have here x minus some number times, or x minus some number times x minus some other number. Again, I'm going to think about two numbers that multiply together to make 12 and add together to make 13. Now, sometimes students get confused on this, but if I think about these factors of 12 right here, 1 and 12. Well, 1 times 12 equals 12, and 1 plus 12 is 13. So I have here x minus 1 times x minus 12 equals 0. My next step that I want to take here is I want to set each of these in their own equation. X minus 1 equals 0, and x minus 12 equals 0, and then solve them. Add 1 to both sides here, and I get x equals 1. And in this one, I'm going to add 12 to both sides here, and I get x equals 12. All right, example number 6. I'm going to take this positive 56, bring it over here, giving me a negative 56 and setting this equal to 0. So I have here x squared minus x minus 56 equals 0. Now, seeing that my c value is negative, this tells me that my binomials here are going to be plus minus. So I'm going to have x plus something times x minus something equals 0. So I think of two numbers that multiply together to make 56, and when I subtract them, I get 1, because see this negative x, it's a negative 1x. So, and I get 8 times 7. And now since my b value is negative, that means I need to put my greater number next to the negative. So it's going to be x plus 7 times x minus 8 equals 0. I set each binomial as its own equation equal to 0. And then I solve. But here I have to subtract 7 from both sides. And I get x equals negative 7. And here I have to add 8 to both sides. And I get x equals positive 8. All right, one more example. Let's take a look at a real world situation. So it says here, a rectangular porch has dimensions of x plus 12 and x plus 5 feet. If the area of the porch floor is 120 square feet, what are its length and width? Write an equation for the problem. Substitute 120 for A for the area of the porch. So let's go ahead and take a look here at our equation. Okay? And so first, think, whenever you're doing a problem like this, it's always a good idea to just draw a diagram of it. So here is my rectangular porch, and the length is x plus 12 feet, and the width is x plus 5 feet. And we know that area is length times width. So if we use that with A, we're going to say length x plus 12 times my width x plus 5, that equals A, the area of my porch. Okay, so let's go ahead and FOIL. So we say x times x, that's x squared. X times 5, that's 5x. 12 times x, that's 12x. And 12 times 5, that's 60. And that equals our area, A. Well, now we know that the area, A, is 120. So let's go ahead and take this A and substitute 120 for A. Okay. Give me my pen. Here we go, sorry. There we go, 120. Again, I can do two things here. Number one, I could combine 5x and 12x, okay, which I forgot to do. And I also need to set this equation equal to 0 so I can solve it. So if I combine like terms, I have here x squared, 5x plus 12x is plus 17x plus 60 equals 120. Then to set this to 0, think about moving the 120 over here, or you could also just think, it's the same thing, subtracting 120 from both sides. Okay, and we get x squared plus 17x minus 60 equals 0. Okay, and now we're going to go ahead and factor this. So we have here x squared plus 17x minus 60 equals 0. I see that my c value is negative, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to factor that up here. Okay, so I see that my c value is negative, so what that tells me is that I'm going to have x plus some number times x minus some number equals 0. So now I got to think of two numbers that multiply together to make negative 60, and when I subtract, because I have opposite signs, I end up with 17. If I think of the factors of 60, okay, I recognize that 3 times 20 is 60, and 20 minus 3 is 17. So that gives us what we want. So our numbers are 3 and 20. All right? And since my b value is positive, that means the 20 needs to go next to the plus sign, and the 3 needs to go next to the negative sign. And finally, like before, we need to set each of these binomials equal to 0. So we have here x plus 20 equals 0, and x minus 3 equals 0. Okay? And we solve both of these equations. Here, I would have to subtract 20 from both sides, and I get x equals negative 20, and here I would have to add 3 to both sides, and I get x equals 3. Now, since this is a real-world situation, we're talking about measuring a real-world object like a rectangular porch, only one of these numbers makes sense, and that would be x equals 3, because x cannot equal negative 20 because we cannot measure real things like rectangular porches with negative numbers. So x has to equal 3, which tells me if x equals 3, then the length is 3 plus 12, which is 15, and the width is 3 plus 5, which is 8. And if you look at it, 15 times 8 does indeed equal 120.